All right. Hello, everybody. My name is Andrew Kalman. I work for College Advancement at Dickinson College, and I just want to welcome everybody today to our virtual Alumni Week program with Eric Denker, class of 75. We're really looking forward to this, and though we can't be on campus right now with everything going on, we're happy that we're still able to connect with you and engage with you through this platform. Without further ado, I'm going to turn it over to Eric. And I will let everybody know, I'm going to mute everybody. All their audio will be muted. You can have your webcam on if you'd like. That there's no preference there, but I will mute everybody so we have Eric's full attention. And then at the end too, if you'd like to ask questions, please feel free to use the chat feature to ask questions, and we can answer those at the end. Eric's open to a little Q&A after it's all over. So without further ado, I'll turn it over to Eric.
So, wouldn't you know, just as we're starting, a helicopter just went over DuPont Circle, so that's what that sound was in the background. So, I'm Can everyone hear me? Good. Hold up your thumb. Good. So I'm very pleased to be able to be here with you today and to share some favorite works from the National Gallery. I hope everyone is staying well and safe, and that this hasn't been as grueling an experience as it might have been, but I hope all of you are well. I'm here in the center of Washington. I'm at DuPont Circle. We've had our share of difficulties, but I think we're doing fine at this point, and keeping as safe as possible. I should mention that my wife and I, Meredith Gill, and I have a house in Carlisle, and every so often we sneak up to Carlisle for the weekend, so everything looks good there, and things seem to be going okay. So a little bit of background. And I thought you might like to look at a beautiful painting by Mary Cassatt of the little girl in a blue armchair while I give you the background. As of this week, I'm at the National Gallery in one capacity or another for 42 years. And in the meanwhile, having served in the education division in various different roles, I'm now the head of adult programming. I also have taught a little bit part-time, and I was the curator at the Corcoran for 8 years as well in the print and drawing department. But my great love is to be in front of paintings and exchanging information, not simply talking about the paintings, because I learn something each time from the group I'm with. And so I thought I'd put this painting up to begin with as the, let's say, eye candy for the beginning of the presentation and the introduction. The little girl in the blue armchair, painted in the late 1870s by Cassatt, is of a little girl sitting in this overstuffed blue armchair. She is clearly not wanting to sit there and pose. She's restless. And as you look at her, you can see that Cassatt has captured that restlessness of children. But as you look at it, you'll see that she's also managed to work her skirt all the way up around her waist. That's not a tartan, it really is her skirt. And so Cassatt captures this very unladylike little girl, and she is played off against Cassatt's little Belgian Griffin Batty that's enjoying being on the overstuffed furniture there on the other side. The painting was helped by Degas' assistants in doing the floor and the windows in the back, so it's really a collaborative effort, and it was the first great painting by Cassatt in an Impressionist exhibition. But what I wanted to do was to give you a little background, because we're going to spend the next hour in the West Building of the National Gallery. And here is a photograph of the West Building and the East Building there on your screen above. The building was constructed between 1937 and 41. the neoclassical style that was the trademark of John Russell Pope, used on so many buildings here in the Capitol. The East Building, over to the upper right over here, is I.M. Pei's greatest building in America and one of the great modern elements of architecture in the Capitol. Then you can see the relationship by looking at the map down below. The West Building is devoted to American and European art up to about 1900, 1910. And this is a map that shows you an overview. The rotunda is here in the center, dividing the building into two equal sides. The galleries from 1 up to 32 are Italian, then Northern Spanish and Northern art up to Gallery 51 and these smaller galleries. Over here on the right, this is French 18th and early 19th century art, British art, and then this far right section is for American. Across the hall, this is the great collection of French 19th century art. We will dip into all of those sections over the course of the next hour. And here's a view of the rotunda. And the rotunda is based on the Pantheon in Rome. It uses a kind of modified Tuscan column with those Ionic capitals. What you're looking into the dome, however, is a false dome. That is plywood and acoustic tiles. It hangs from the real dome. And there is a space in between the two which is used for storage on the 82-foot level. The oculus here is at 101 feet. It's closed, even though it's based on the open oculus in the Pantheon. The climate being somewhat more changeable here, it's necessary for us to protect the works of art from expansion and contraction by way of heat and humidity. And here is a more classical view of the rotunda with the statue of Mercury, with the beautiful floral arrangements, because we were endowed with a gift to provide flowers and bushes, and received one of the great gifts for the 50th anniversary, the Haskell Ames azalea collection, among the first azaleas to come to America. Mercury, and this is, I think, a story of art history. Mercury here, when I came to the gallery 42 years ago, was attributed to John Bologna in the 16th century. A few years went by and testing showed that it was in fact from later on. So then it was called by Adrian de Vries in the 18th century. And then another few years went by and they did chemical analysis, and it turns out to have been done actually in the beginning of the 19th century. So we're always actively reassessing, thinking about what the works of art, where their place is and how they functioned. If we go into the Italian section, this is a favorite small painting, and many of these are small. This is by Fra Carnevale. He was a monk, and he was a specialist in the art of perspective. This is a single vanishing point perspective system. The artist started by creating a grid pattern. He started with the horizon line, which would go just across here. You can see where the sky meets the shrubbery here, and then picking that as the vanishing point, and aligning illusionistically all of the diagonals, all of the orthogonals, diagonals that are illusionistically directed into space, and the tiles down below. And this gives us a rational way to measure this space. It's based on the idea that if we stand in the middle of the road and look down the road, it seems that the two sides of the road converge. But in fact, we know intellectually that they don't. It is an optical illusion. What happens here is that all of this allows this to be a measurable fictive space. And if we understand that these are squares of marble and that they are square, and we understand that the Madonna here in this painting of the Annunciation is about 5 feet tall, if we put her down on her side, we could carefully measure exactly the distance to this back wall. One point that I always like about this painting, that even the Archangel Gabriel's wings point up to the vanishing point. And I think that's very clever on the part of Fra Carnevale. As you look at the painting, however, he wasn't perfect. He didn't understand quite. So if you look down here at the base of the urn, you'll see it's not quite at the right angle. It seems to float just a little bit off of the floor. Nonetheless, it's a marvelous, colorful painting in very good condition. It would be impossible to measure the importance of this painting. This is Ginevra de Benjy. It is the only Leonardo that is in a public collection in the United States. It was purchased from the Duchy of Liechtenstein back in 1966, paid for privately by the daughter of the founder of the National Gallery, by Elsa Mellon Bruce. And so it is in many ways a trademark for the National Gallery. Ginevra was about 16 years old when this painting was done. Leonardo was no more than 21 or 22 when he started the painting. But it's revolutionary in a lot of ways. The first is, it is one of the earliest paintings in the Italian tradition to be done almost entirely in oil. And that means that the oil, which dries very slowly, can be manipulated to make these beautiful curls as they come down on either side, the delicate shadows around her eyes. And the use of light by Leonardo is exquisite. Her forehead is bathed in light, and then there's this subtle shadow, and back into light, and then down, cast shadow beneath her chin. So we can admire Leonardo's technique in this regard, his use of the juniper behind, and then this softly focused area that's over here. What Leonardo understood was that when you're looking at a landscape through a hazy atmosphere, it will lack definition. And so as he paints this area of the landscape, he uses his fingers. He uses his thumb and his fingers to blur these outlines so they appear to be further in the distance, creating atmospheric perspective. Now, there are two things that you can't tell just by looking at the painting that are innovations. The first is, this is not the original size of the painting, which at this point is about 16 by 16 inches. In fact, it's been cut down. The labs have determined that there's water damage on the lower edge, and this square format would have been unusual in the Renaissance. Instead, she originally had hands and was situated, anchored, if you will, in front of the landscape. And so with the research that goes into the studies of Leonardo, what they've determined is that this is what it originally looked like. And those hands are based on a drawing by Leonardo in Windsor Palace, and she holds that small flower. And you can see that she's been cut down by a third. That's quite a bit of paint that's missing. Also, you'll notice this tree has been partly cut down. The other innovation that is not readily apparent is that she's facing forward. To this point in Italian art, women had always been depicted in profile. It was considered inappropriate for a woman to gaze out at whoever the viewer might be. And so the young Leonardo, coming out of the workshop of a sculptor and painter, Andrea del Verrocchio, had just been seeing sculpture that was for the first time half length and of figures that were meant to be seen from the front. And so he would have known this sculpture, which could possibly even been modeled by Ginevra. We're not entirely sure. And we can see that he's very interested also in the gesture of the hands as well as the frontal view. The painting's on a wooden panel. It's on a poplar panel, and it's painted on both sides. This is actually very good for the preservation of the painting, so that there are no wormholes easily going in because the painting is sealed. Here are the hands that were used in the reconstruction that we made, the really digital reconstruction. There's a view of the landscape. And we actually have Leonardo's fingerprints. And I think many of you will find it amusing that those fingerprints were found early on before we had the capability. The FBI came and examined the painting and showed us the fingerprints. So I'm sure that Leonardo's fingerprints are on file somewhere with the NSA and the FBI. Here's the back of the painting, and you can see quite readily where the damage is down here, that flat black, brown area down at the bottom. It is a motif that is meant to cast different achievements on Ginevra herself. So we have the laurel and the palm leaves, symbols of intellectual achievement and moral superiority. They are wrapped around this spring of juniper. In Italian, juniper is Ginepro, Ginepra, Ginevra. It's a play on her name. It says virtutum forma decorat, which means that beauty adorns virtue, but that's not what it originally said. X-rays reveal that this word has been changed, and that originally what this said was virtue and honor. And when it said virtue and honor, that was, in fact, the motto of the Venetian ambassador to Florence at the time, a man named Bernardo Bembo. And so we believe that he had taken Ginevra as his platonic ideal beauty. There are poems back and forth to each other. And in fact, she was considered a very beautiful woman at the time. And there are 10 different poems about her from the Medici circle, including 2 by Lorenzo de' Medici himself. A couple of small details here that sometimes escape notice. This is the seal of the Duchy of Liechtenstein from 1733. So we know that it was already in this collection by that moment. Unfortunately, the inventory seal doesn't give us the size, so we don't know if it had been cut down yet. We don't learn that it had been cut down until an inventory in the 1780s. But I want you to notice, because it's easily overlooked, this speckled background. And the speckled background is imitation porphyry. Porphyry, a very expensive, very hard stone from one particular place in Egypt, and it had recently been used, the actual porphyry, for the Medici tombs in San Lorenzo. And we think this is a nod to her importance because Ginevra de' Benjy was from the second wealthiest family in Florence, the Benjy. Her father and grandfather were both managers of the famous Medici Bank. Her brother was a friend of Leonardo. The painting was probably done on her betrothal to Luigi Niccolini, another important family but somewhat impoverished, and she came with a huge dowry. We don't have a record of the dowry when it was given, but he, Niccolini, predeceased her. And when a husband predeceased the wife in Renaissance Florence, they had to return, the family had to return the dowry. So we know it was a very 1,200 florins, excessively large dowry, partly because the family couldn't afford to pay it back. So the only Leonardo in America, and his signature piece dating to about 1475, 1474, 75. This year, we had the opportunity to commemorate and celebrate Raffaello on the 500th anniversary of his death on April 6th. It happens to be the day he was born as well. It's one of those rare individuals like Shakespeare, born and died on the same date. He did this little image of St. George and the Dragon. It is perhaps not much bigger than what you have on the screen in front of you. And it is done with a miniature's care. It was done in 1505, 1506. And it was done for the Duke Montefeltro of Urbino, but not for the Duke to keep. It was done as a gift to the courier who had come from England to make the Duke of Montefeltro the Knight of the Order that was of St. George, great British patron saint. So as you look, it shows St. George, derived from the Golden Legend. He's a saint who rescues this princess, subdues the dragon. takes her girdle, leads it back into town, and slays it in front of the king and the townspeople so that they will convert. It is a stunning small painting, and it has the most fabled history. So we know it's taken back to England by the courier, and it disappears for a while. And then, in the early part of the 17th century, it goes into the collection of the Earls of Pembroke, and that would be William and Philip Herbert. Philip Herbert is the 4th Lord of Pembroke. For those of you who are in mind of literature, you may recognize them. Shakespeare's first portfolio was dedicated to them. So here they have this great Raphael, which they then trade to Charles I. So it's in the king's collection until he's beheaded. It enters the market again. It goes to France. It's owned by Pierre Crozat, and then eventually by Denis Diderot, the encyclopedist, who functions as the agent for Catherine the Great of Russia. And so it ends up in Russia. So it's owned by kings, it's owned by patrons, and eventually it goes into the Hermitage. And when Stalin needs money in 1931, he sells it to Andrew Mellon, and Andrew Mellon gives it to the National Gallery. So it has this wonderful, marvelous history. It is very detailed, and so I used a couple of places in the lecture to give you details. And so if you look very carefully here, you will see that Raphael has signed it on the bridle, Raffaello down over here, and that the knight has on a garter. And on the garter, it says honi soit, which is the beginning of the phrase honi soit qui mal y pense, shamed be he who think of it, which is the motto of the Royal Order of the Garter for the Order of St. George. So there are all these wonderful details here. Look at the marvelous recreation of light as it plays off the armor, and how that differs from the flesh and from the horse and from even the sword down below. I have to drop in a couple of things from Venice as favorites. This is by Giovanni Bellini, who is the artist who really brings Venice proper into the Renaissance a little bit later than those in Florence. It is of St. Jerome, and he's in his cave, and he's reading the Bible. His great accomplishment was the translation of the Bible from the Greek and the Hebrew into the Vulgate, still used today. And so he's sitting there with the Bible in his cave. But if you just wanted to call attention to St. Jerome, you'd make him a lot bigger. Instead, there are a lot of other interesting aspects that Bellini explores. You'll see a lot of animals, from a salamander down near the well to the squirrel up on the grassy knoll, to the 2 rabbits that are there, to the raven that's up in the tree. The rabbits have a very specific function here. If you look closely, they're nuzzling each other, and they're nuzzling each other beneath fig leaves. And so as you look at them, they are a symbol of St. Jerome's difficulty in having isolated himself in the desert and having very strong erotic dreams. That's why he also holds a stone in his hand to rend his flesh. You can see the lion, his symbol, down there sitting just next to him, all the way down in the right-hand corner. But the rabbits are symbols of fertility, fecundity, and especially in combination with the fig leaves, references to the idea of original sin. And there they are. The gallery was, in 1945, the beneficiary of a pair of paintings, pendants, meant to be seen together, by Antonio Canaletto. And this is one of them. This is the entrance to the Grand Canal, that large church, the Church of Santa Maria della Salute. These were originally commissioned to be sold to a British patron. That's why the large ship that's out there flies the Union Jack. This is the one half, but I want to concentrate on the other that we have. And that's this painting. It's always been a great favorite of mine, even before I began to research it and discovered various different elements about it. So this is called the Piazza San Marco, and it is a beautiful image of what the piazza looked like in the 1740s by Canaletto. And it gives you a full array of Venetian architecture, from the Byzantine Basilica of St. Mark over here, Byzantine style, from consecrated 1090, to the Gothic style of the Doge's Palace there in the center, to the little Renaissance building over here to the right by Sansovino, the guardhouse. And if you look just at the edge up here over to the right, you'll see the bell tower, the Campanile, which is responsible for this shadow. So it tells us it's late in the afternoon, that the Dominican in the distance is preaching, that the people who have their wares, the merchants, are closing up for the day. And down over here on the right, the dentist. You weren't allowed to practice dentistry after dark, for good reason. And so the dentist has his tooth out, and there's a tooth hanging from it. It's his signpost. Well, for many years, it was thought that this was an accurate view of the scene. When I talked to the curator, David Brown, a renowned scholar, and he simply assumed one day while I was talking about the painting that it was accurate. But when I began to look more closely, when I discovered the preparatory drawing, and when I went on site and took photographs, it turns out that it's been manipulated, that what Canaletto needed to do for the British tourist was to suggest that the water was out here to the right. But from where he's standing, given these flag posts, you couldn't have seen the water. And there's the basin of San Marco past the little Renaissance guardhouse. And here's the preparatory drawing. And if you line up the preparatory drawing, the flag posts are okay, but you can see that from that point of view over here to the extreme right, you can't see the water. But Canaletto was counting on the fact that these are people who didn't have Google Earth and couldn't see the water from where they were studying the painting in England, but they were reminded that the water was there. And so here's the painting again, and I want you to notice exactly where the three flag posts are. These are from 1500, and they are important. They're still there today. They flew the flag of the Republic and the two great land empires as well. But notice where the flag posts are. And so I went to the appropriate spot and took this photograph, and they weren't where they should be. And again, from the appropriate spot, you look over here to the right, and there's no view out of the water. We're talking about this area of Venice right here in the center, and we're in the Piazza San Marco, if you can see where I put the cursor there. And so if we go back to the painting and look, one of the aspects is not only did he do the view from two different angles and combine them, we're also up above, perhaps at a second-story window. So I talked my way into a high-end glass shop and went over to the window and took this photograph. And the photograph gives us the proper angle of vision, and now I've put us in a position where we can see out to the water. So these are aspects, and we explored this in a show called Canaletto and His Rivals back about 10 years ago. That's club soda, by the way. And so I thought we might move over in the Dutch area for a little while before we end up in the French painting collection. The Dutch in the 17th century had a very different patronage system. The church was no longer a major patron of the arts. The Reformed Church didn't believe in religious imagery. And we know that the Dutch artists had to actually deal with a large segment of the middle class and rising merchant class, and they wanted to see the world around them. They wanted to see their streets, their cities. They wanted to see their boats and estuaries. In this case, they wanted to see something that was part of their daily life. And this is the interior of the Oude Kerk, the old church in Amsterdam. It's done by an artist named Emmanuel de Witte, W-I-T-T-E. He specialized in doing these kinds of views. And so here we are in the interior. It is, again, a single vanishing point perspective system that takes us deep into the background, where there is a group of men coming in, and apparently it's a funeral taking place, because that entourage will come up here by these two men and their dog, who look down an open grave, people being buried beneath the pavement in Dutch churches in the 17th century. If you look very closely, you'll see there's a skull down here to the lower right, so it becomes a meditation on death, on the vanity of everyday life that these two men are having in discussion. But amidst death, there's life. So if you look over here, there's a peasant woman down to the lower right. She's nursing. There's a little boy who's wandered over to see what she's doing. They have a little dog by them. It's a scene of daily life. And for the Dutch, as opposed to the French, as opposed to the Italians, every part of daily life was considered appropriate for depiction. There are themes that would have been considered vulgar in the 17th century in Italian and French art, but not in Dutch art. It was part of God's great creation. So you pan from over on the right and you look across, and there is a dog lifting his leg on the column over here. And this isn't meant to be anti-clerical any more than the man asleep in the pews over here. It is simply part of everyday life in a space that wasn't just a church, but was a community center as well. And there's a close-up showing you the two little dogs that are there at the column. As you look at the close-up, look at the stone that's raised over on the right. I was in Amsterdam on gallery business, on courier work, and had a chance to go into the church, and the artist took a little bit of artistic liberty. The stones always run lengthwise with the apse of the church, never from side to side. So that was changed simply for pictorial purposes. It was easier to see that the stone had been moved than if we saw it lengthwise. In the National Gallery, this painting hangs across from the Emmanuel de Witte that we first saw. It is perhaps the single most important acquisition that we have made in this century. So it is by Salomon Roesdael. He was the lesser-known uncle of Jacob van Roesdael. He was the first artist who liberated the Dutch palette, the color scheme of landscape, from being monochromatic to being more colorful. The blues here in the sky, absolutely luscious, thickly painted, and that crop of trees right there in the center, each one very delicately done. Now, none of these paintings are ever done on the spot. There are a few sketches that are done on the spot. They're taken back to the studio. This one was elaborated in the studio. So we're not to understand that this is an actual location, despite the architecture that you see at the end of this strip of land, despite the way in which the ferry, this is a landscape with a ferry boat that you see here, all of this is constructed, if you will, reconstructed in the studio. It is a painting that shows Dutch daily life. There's a ferry boat with a horse-drawn carriage, sleigh. There are people who are on horseback. There's a man pulling a chain to get them across the estuary. And over here, there's a young boy chasing a wagon, a couple of people on a bench commenting perhaps on the weather. And then, because it's a Dutch painting, it seems to be an aspect of their daily life. Here, over here, there's actually a bull mounting a cow. It wasn't thought to be vulgar. It was simply another part of everyday life within the Dutch tradition. And there you can see the close-up of both the ferry boat on the right and of those cows and the bull. When the painting came into the collection, every painting has to be approved by the trustees. It is a painting with an interesting history, which I'll get to in a moment. The trustees, who have always thought of the National Gallery as a family gallery, questioned the curator about what was going on over on that side of the painting. And Arthur Wheelock, very distinguished Dutch curator, said the bull was simply trying to get a better view of the ferry boat as it came into the shore. As you look at the painting, let me give you a bit of background of how it came into the National Gallery's collection, because it's another of those fabled stories. It was owned by a dealer in Amsterdam as part of his stock in 1940. His name was Jacques Houtstikker. And Jacques Houtstikker had had dealings with some Germans in the 1930s. But in 1940, as they approached Amsterdam, he went to escape. He went on board ship with his wife and a daughter, and he fell down the stairs and died. Consequently, the Germans entered Amsterdam and took all of his stock. And this painting went to Hermann Göring, among other paintings. When the war was over, it was repatriated, but there was no record as to whether it had actually been sold to the Germans or whether they had taken it. It took until 2005 for the family to produce the necessary documentation. The family took it back, and with their help, we purchased this painting. And it's a really not only stunning painting, but it's a very important painting for the collection. It is one of a handful of the greatest Dutch landscapes that we have. A nod to Flemish painting, which very much of the same mentality as Dutch painting. There were scenes of everyday life, and the scene that you see here is of card players in an inn. The figure that shows us his cards over here is actually Ostade himself, who was the painter. This is a self-portrait, and so he brings us into the game by showing us his cards. I'm sorry, this is by David Teniers. It's very similar to an Ostade in the collection. And that's David Teniers, and he's showing you that he's going to beat these two people over here who are drinking and smoking. And in the inn, there are people who have passed out. There are people heading for the door with ideas in mind about spending the evening. And then, as Dutch and Flemish paintings often have this kind of detail, over here there's a man relieving himself in the corner. So these are paintings that weren't bought by this level of society. They were bought by the middle class, and they were meant to be didactic. We don't behave this way, they say to their children. There are people who do, and that's fine, but we don't behave this way. And up here on the wall is the key to the painting. It has both the date of 1658, but it has an owl with spectacles on one side and a candle on the other. That's from a Dutch saying. What good are spectacles and light to the owl if he refuses to see? What good is etiquette if they refuse to observe it in the inn? And so, delightful painting that tells us something about how people dressed, their surroundings, how people comported themselves. Among the great landscape painters, Rembrandt, who only did a dozen paintings, is highly regarded. And this is his image of the mill. Probably represents a memory of where he'd grown up in Leiden, great bulwark here above the river, and the mill. I wanted to mention this painting primarily because it shows something that's ongoing at the National Gallery. Paintings often accumulate a great deal of discolored varnish and grime over many years. So as you look at this painting, this is how it appears now. But until the 1970s, it looked like this. And people thought that it was very romantic, it was very Rembrandt-esque, but when a new curator came in the 1970s, he said, it's time that we clean this painting so you can see what Rembrandt actually intended. This looks like a storm is coming on, or maybe it's simply the end of the day. Whereas this tells us quite clearly that beautiful blue sky is about to give way to storms as figures row back from the water on their boat, as the laundresses down here take care of the water, as the shepherd over here husbands his sheep to come up the hill. Portraiture was essential for the Dutch, and the earliest great Dutch portraitist in the beginning of the 17th century is in fact Frans Hals. And so we're pleased that we have a nice selection of Hals. The mark of a great Dutch collection, the early part of the 20th century, was to have Frans Hals and to have Rembrandt, perhaps Jan Steen. Vermeer comes a little bit later in the idea of collecting in this way. So this is Frans Hals, and he has a particular task. He has to do a figure that's half length, relatively small because Dutch homes weren't huge, and he has to give the figure a certain animation. And so what does he do? He turns him on a chair that's facing away from us. Nothing would be more boring than if he was facing toward us and right there in the center. Instead, he turns away from us, and he has his body facing in a different direction from his gaze. So the body faces over here to the right, but he turns to look out at us, as if we've just come into the room, and we've just caught his attention. He's not talking to us. He's not giving us a lot of emotion, but he is showing a certain informality. And look at the hat and the way the hat is cocked and the flower. He wants us to understand that he's not simply a wealthy young man, but that he's fashionable. And we know who it is. The date is over here, the age of the figure, the symbol of the Cowman's family here on the wall. We know just who it is. But again, he doesn't really communicate with us. He seems both a little shy and perhaps slightly arrogant. This was Hals working in the early part of the century. And so we acquired this painting back in 1999. It's always one of my favorites. High school students, college students respond to it very readily. Because as you look at this painting, you know precisely what the sitter wanted, what he was paying for. He wanted you to know that he was a dandy, that he dressed in a beautiful outfit, that he was important in society. Why? Because this is under stilt. He's aged 41, and he is a member of a militia company, which was only called out on certain occasions, and he is the standard bearer. And so it's under stilt as a standard bearer. So our first assumption is this must have been the costume of the standard bearer, but that turns out to be wrong. Instead, only the sash is necessary, and the banner. All the rest is his choice. And so Anders Stilt had a particular idea, and he goes to a man named Verspronck and orders this painting. Now, Verspronck, as opposed to Hals, was a specialist in reproducing the way light played off of different textures. So I want you to notice the difference between this kid glove and that ribbon and that beautiful satin sleeve and the lace that's used both as piping and up here next to the ribbon. The felt hat that you see, the difference between that and the way light plays across feathers or banners or even the glass hilt of the ceremonial sword. Now, why is it that somebody would want their painting done in this way? Clearly, he wanted to remember this moment because, and there's a detail, he had just gotten engaged. And once you were married, you couldn't wear this outfit anymore. You couldn't be the standard bearer. So he wants to remember what it was like when he could be part of the militia and be the standard bearer and not simply wear the dark clothes and somber outfits that the Dutch wore after their marriage. It's wonderful to contrast those two paintings by one of the earliest paintings we have by a woman in the collection. And the woman that you see here is Judith Leister, and look how good she is because she's all of about 20 years old. She wants us to know certain information. So first, it's clear she wants us to know she's a painter. It wasn't easy for a woman to be a painter in 17th century Holland. You either came from a Dutch painting family or you married into a family, but she wants us to know she's a painter. So she holds a brush in one hand and she holds the palette in the other. And notice how many brushes she's holding down there below the palette. An enormous number. Nobody ever would have this many brushes in their hand while they're painting. We get it. She's a painter. And what does she paint? She paints scenes from everyday life. And that's why we have that image over to the right of the violinist, of a peasant violinist. That turns out to be part of an actual painting that she did. Okay, so now we know she's a painter. And we know she's about 20 years old. And she's kind of cute. And she challenges herself by putting on this marvelous, elaborate lace collar and trying to discern the difference between that and the cuff that you see and the costume, the wood of the chair. But of course, this also makes it a fiction because nobody ever painted wearing this collar. She had a model who sat wearing this. And she painted the model wearing the outfit. And then she, looking in the mirror, painted her hand and her face. It used to be assumed, because the pose is so similar to Frans Hals, that she was a pupil of Frans Hals. That's unfortunately undocumented. Instead, there's only one document. She sues Frans Hals because he steals two of her pupils. And it was difficult for her. Men were jealous of her talent and of her ability. And so actually feminist art historians in the last few years have suggested that it's no coincidence that in her self-portrait, she's holding a sharp-pointed object at a vulnerable part of the violinist's pants, so that this may not entirely be coincidence. However, you won't find that on the National Gallery website. Perhaps the greatest self-portraitist was Rembrandt. And Rembrandt does this image of himself. He's 53 years old. He's had a difficult life, but it's not simply that he wants to convey, using the face, physiognomy, that he's sad, but he wants to convey a deep human emotion. He understood the human condition. In order to be able to do this kind of painting, you first had to be able to make this kind of pose. And so he studied his expression throughout his life. And this expression, sad and sober, but not sentimental, looks out at us as if he has undergone the vicissitudes of life, but has managed to overcome them. That he paints this portrait. You'll notice he doesn't put a great deal of emphasis on the costume. He doesn't even finish the hands. Instead, he concentrates our attention on his face and on those eyes. And if you look just to the right of the eyes, you'll see his thinning hair, accomplished not with brushwork, but by scratching into the wet paint up in this area, just above his ear. And here you can see the care with which he's done each wrinkled wrinkle on his brow, the jowls as they begin to sag. But again, he's not asking for our sympathy. He's meeting our gaze head on. And we're fortunate that we have this self-portrait in the collection, but we have others, but they're works on paper. So we have here this red chalk drawing of him when he's about 28 years old, 27, 28 years old. Or this print of him from about the age of 24. And as you look at this print, I always think it should come with a sound. It's Rembrandt trying to look surprised. So he's going, ooh, what's happening? And it will be useful to him when he goes to do biblical narratives and mythological scenes that he understands how the human face explores inner emotion. After all, when it comes down to it, we don't care much what Rembrandt looked like 400 years ago. What we care about is his depth of understanding of the human condition, which is not to say that he was a saint. He could be a very difficult man. And we're not always proud when we read the things that he did, but he had this deep understanding of the human condition. One of the great treasures of the National Gallery, of the 35 Vermeers in existence, we have 4 of them. One of them perhaps finished by one of his sons. This is, I think, arguably the most important of those paintings, and it's called A Woman Holding a Balance. She stares down at the balance, and perhaps past it, looking at the coins, the pearls, the gold that's there. She is thinking about the balance in life. And the giveaway to that is that she is framed by the painting in the background. Painting in the background is Christ at the Last Judgment, weighing who will be saved and who will not, as she balances the material world against the spiritual. It may, in fact, be Vermeer's wife. He seems to have used her as a model quite often. She may, in fact, be pregnant, and that would only add to that meaning the significance of weighing earthly treasures against the spiritual, which is behind her. It is lovingly, carefully painted. The light comes in across the scene. It picks up her hand, the balance, right in the center of the painting. It picks up her cowl and the nice fur lining that you see on either side. And it picks up those coins and pearls on the table. But there's an anomaly here, even after looking for only a few minutes. We know that Vermeer made a deliberate aberration here. Look at the frame of this painting. Notice that there are 2 gilded edges over here, but none over here. What would have happened if he had extended this gilding all the way around? It would have distracted us from concentrating on the hand, which is all important, which is the key to the painting. And so kind of counted on the fact that we wouldn't notice that there was gilding over here, but not on this side. Nobody ever was better at showing people lost in thought, lost in contemplation. This is, I think, one of the essential achievements of Vermeer. Perhaps only the French painter Watteau ever came close. And there you can see the painting in the background and those beautiful light highlights on the hand, on the cowl, and on the frame. I think we should talk about one last Dutch painting. I always enjoy talking about this painting. It is by Klaus Heyde, a painter of still lifes. Dutch artists specialized. It was necessary once you established a reputation in the marketplace to accumulate patrons. It is this grand still life with a mincemeat pie. Whenever you look at a still life, there are things that you need to take into account. Are the objects the actual size? Is the artist intending to fool the eye, to make them trompe l'oeil? When you look at a still life, the vantage point is important. Is it from above, below, or at table height? In this case, it's at table height. So we've been dining with somebody wealthy. It's clear that they're wealthy. They have a brass candlestick, they have a pewter pitcher, they have a gold-lidded cup. And then they have Venetian glass for their vinegar. They have a pewter salt cellar over here. They've been eating a mincemeat pie only eaten on special occasions. And they have the most beautiful tableware and pewter plates. So the next question is, okay, we've been eating with people who are wealthy, but where are we in the course of the meal? Well, we're toward the end. The pie is mostly gone. The mussel shells are open. And yet, even at the end of the meal, we can read some detail that they haven't been behaving very well. Perhaps they've had too much to drink, that they've broken a glass over here, that they've turned over the taza over here and the other glass over here, and that the tablecloth is disheveled. Then suddenly, it's the end of the meal, but we notice something that hasn't been touched. Right there in the center, the bread, which stands in for Christ, it stands in for the afterlife. And so we realize that this is a painting where the bread hasn't been touched, that it suggests that these people have been too materialistic and that they haven't concentrated enough on the spiritual. And then we begin to read it as a vanitas painting, that life itself, that beauty, fame, fortune are ephemeral, that the afterlife is more important. Symbols for that include the candle having been burned down, including the broken glass over here, including this little cone that held pepper. These are the various things that they would have understood in that way. The single greatest detail, however, of the importance of the afterlife is up here in the picture. You have to look very closely at the reflection. And so there's that little cone for the pepper, but over here, look at the reflection, and reflected on its side in the picture, there's a human skull. There's the forehead, the eye sockets, the jaw, down over there. It is a painting that's a reminder. Now, this is a commission painting. Some of these objects belong to the family, but it was also meant to be didactic for your children, your grandchildren, your nieces and the nephews. That yes, we're wealthy, but we can't neglect the afterlife, that this is essential for us as well. And the painter, as often Dutch painters, very cleverly signs the painting. How? See this tablecloth, and this part has been folded back. There's his signature, all the way down there along the edge of the part that has been folded to come back, as if it was the maker of that tablecloth. Very cleverly done. So we come to the French paintings, and I want to show you a few French paintings fairly quickly. There's Napoleon, life-size, more than life-size, and it too is a painting that has a story. It's by Jacques-Louis David, the leading neoclassical painter in France from 1785 up until 1815. He worked for Napoleon. This is a commission painting. And Napoleon wants to be thought of as an important general and as an important civil leader. And so we see him in his study, a clock behind him. He's working at 20 after 4 in the morning. He's been working at his desk on the Code de Napoleon over here. He's a great military leader. You can see the decorations, the sword. Down here, Plutarch's Lives of the Great Ancient Warriors and Statesmen, and even a battle map. So all of it comes together as a piece of political propaganda done in that very fine enamel-like surface that we get from neoclassical painting. And there you can see the details of the Code de Napoleon on the desk, of the bees, symbols of Charlemagne and Carolingian rulers in France's past. And where would we be without talking about some realism and impressionism? So this is a painting that was done by Manet. It is called The Ball, the Masked Ball at the Opera. It's not a particularly large painting. I would guess, about 2 feet across, maybe a little less. And it represents the opera. But if I ask you not to look at the painting for a moment, and instead think about if somebody told you you were going to see a painting of a ball at the Opera House in Paris in 1873, what elements you might expect. So, one is, what is a masked ball? It's a dance. You might expect to see people dancing. Not here. Where would it take place? In a nice ballroom. Not here. We're in a lobby. We're in a foyer. We would expect there to be music. There's no music here. And we'd expect there to be couples dressed in a similar way. Instead, here we have 30 men dressed in formal wear with their top hats, and we have 8 women who are here, and they are dressed to attract attention. Each one wears a domino, wears a mask. One has dropped her mask. This one has dropped her mask. And they're trying to draw attention. So what are they doing? They may have an arm around somebody close by, a hand on a man's chest, and an arm around the waist. These 2 women toward the front have gifts. They've accepted gifts from the men that they're with, and they're coming off. The woman that you see here is caressing this man's cheek. And finally, the woman you see to the extreme right is leaning right into the lap of this man who's seated on a partition. You see, these are his slacks and the leather bottoms to his shoes over here. She's covering up the point of contact with a fan. What's going on here? This is seen from the early 1870s of high-class prostitution, of sexual commerce. These are courtesans. They've come to the opera to look for fares for the evening. It's not illegal. People might have considered it immoral, but it's not illegal. And Manet, as a good realist, determines that he will show it. In fact, these are his friends, the composer Chabrier, the writer Duret. Over here, the painter Guillaumin, and you see this brown beard over here, this brown beard, 2 from the right, that's Manet. He's not involved in the activity. It's the job of the realist to record the activity, not to condemn nor condone it, simply to record it. What's brilliant about this is it also looks as if it's a fragment, but it's not. Based on photography, which could crop figures on the left and the right and above in framing, Manet has employed the same device, but for very good use. What's going on up here? It's not that the painting has been cut down. These are 2 people on the next level foyer. It's 2 of these same women. This one with her legs is on our side of the balustrade. But they're cut off because, as Linda Nochlin, a brilliant art historian, has written, that's what's being bartered down below, legs and torsos, not individuals or personalities, legs and torsos. So it functions as a kind of signpost for what's going on down here. The figure over here, dressed in a clown outfit, seen from behind, has his hand up. He's attempting to stop them from this activity. You'll notice nobody's paying attention to him. This was the head of France at the time, Marshal MacMahon. He blamed the defeat in the Franco-Prussian War on immorality, not on military unpreparedness. So he tries to legislate this out of existence, but nobody pays attention to him. And there are close-ups of the 2 details. And the legs up above. One of the artists in the Impressionist circle was Auguste Renoir, and he painted this image of the Pont Neuf, looking across the busiest bridge in Paris, 30,000 people crossing this bridge every day. The Impressionist program was to denote the exact lighting conditions of the moment, the time of year, the time of day, the weather conditions. Here, Renoir puts the horizon about halfway up so we can see that it's a somewhat cloudy day, a partly cloudy day. He also, knowing that we're looking south, gives us the exact time of day by the shadows coming off of all the figures who function as an hourglass. Lots of different types, the nursemaid and her child, policemen, soldiers, vendors, wealthier people in horse-drawn carts. They move very quickly. We know from letters that this figure was sent down, it's his brother, to ask people the time, to ask people directions, to get them to slow down so he could paint them. And so he's here, and he's here again. Renoir puts him in twice. And finally, a nod to the post-impressionist part of the collection. We have marvelous works by Van Gogh, Seurat, including a whole series of small-scale paintings, studies for the Sunday afternoon on the island of the Grand Jatte. We have one of the great Cézanne collections. There are about 40 paintings by Cézanne that we have. And finally, we have great Van Gogh and Gauguin. And this is an important painting by Gauguin. It's a self-portrait. It was originally painted in exchange for being able to stay in an inn, Marie-Henri's Inn, out in Le Pôle d'Eu in Brittany. So it was a cabinet door, and he paints this self-portrait looking out at us, and he shows us that artists are important in your society. They're saints, there's a halo, but they're pariahs as well. You can see the apples and the serpent down in his hand. And he floats this face looking out at us, looking askance, somewhat skeptical about us looking at this painting in this lower class inn. Even his lip curled slightly. The red and the yellow in the background are actually based on a painting that he would have known. Van Gogh's painting with the bandage on his ear. But whereas Van Gogh makes it clear that it's the background, Gauguin suggests that the head floats against the yellow and red of the background. We're moving further and further away from realism, further and further away from representation, and more in the direction of the abstract. And that's where we'll go in the 20th century. That brings me to the conclusion of our lecture today. I'm sorry I've gone 10 minutes over. I would be glad to be able to answer questions if you have questions on any of the paintings, or if you want to use email, that's fine as well. The email is e-denker, D-E-N-K-E-R, at nga.gov. And so I'm happy to do that in either event. I'll stop the share for now. And that's great. I get to see everyone at the same time.
If anybody has any questions for Eric, you can unmute yourself and feel free to ask now if you'd like.
Eric, I'm happy to ask a question. Steve Skalak, nice to see you. It seemed like the Italian painters used a lot more symbolic elements in their paintings than the Dutch painters. Is this a trend, or is it just an oversimplification, or is it just the happenstance of the paintings you selected? Unmute yourself.
Now, is that better? So it's a good question. It goes back to the market at the time. Most of the Italian paintings from the 15th, 16th, 17th century were church paintings. And so they had a whole array of symbols that needed to be used that had to do with doctrine and belief. The Dutch, who didn't use their paintings in churches very often, instead, the Dutch had symbols, but they were also committed to looking at the world around them and transcribing their world in a way the Italians didn't prior to the 18th century. And so, yes, I can talk about the symbols in something like the still life or in several of the paintings of everyday life, but there are many more that are pure landscapes, pure portraits, pure scenes of everyday life that don't have that symbolic value. So no, a good question.
Eric, Wendy.
Anybody else?
And can you?
Hi, Wendy.
Eric, hi. So Fred and I are here.
Nice to see you.
And so wonderful to see you. And you are, all these years later, the same incredible storyteller with the paintings, making them come to life, bringing us so much information. I can remember, like yesterday, 1975, and you taking Glenn McCarthy and Judy Olingi and I through so many of these amazing museums in Italy. Thank you so much. This was amazing and quite a feat because you spanned quite a few centuries here apart.
Thanks very much. That's very kind of you. And I remember those trips well, and being in Bologna, and I remember that very well. Thank you.
Thank you, Eric.
Thanks. Anybody else? Again, I'm happy to receive emails and I'll respond to them. At the gallery at the moment, I'm not able to do tours, so I'm preparing lectures, but I have time. I'm happy to be in touch and be able to, and I'm happy to be in touch anyway. It's a time to be engaged with each other.
Thank you, Eric.
Thank you so much.
Thank you very much.
Thanks, Eric.
Thanks.
Thank you. See
I
you all soon.
apologize. I apologize
Bye,
for
Eric.
being late. My daughter had FaceTimed with our granddaughter, who I haven't seen in 3 months. So I had to watch that for a bit.
It's understandable. You might have heard my phone go off in the background. My brother was calling me, and I had to mute him.
Anyway, thanks very much.
Have a good rest of the week.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Thanks, Eric. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.